Good morning. Our lecture for biochemistry would be on enzyme kinetics. Before we delve into enzyme kinetics, let us be refreshed with the definition of enzymes. Remember that enzymes are primarily protein catalysts that increase the rate of reactions without being changed in the overall process. Thereby, enzyme kinetics is a field of biochemistry concerned with the quantitative measurement of the rates of enzymes, catalyzed reactions, and the systematic study of the factors that affect these rates. The objectives of these lectures are the following: discuss the catalysis of enzymes in terms of energy change in a reaction, define free energy of activation, discuss catalysis of enzymes in terms of chemically facilitated active sites, identify the factors influencing velocity of enzyme-catalyzed reactions, discuss the derivation of the Michaelis-Menten Equation, correlate the Lineweaver-Burk plot with the rate of enzyme reaction and inhibition, differentiate the various types of enzyme inhibition, discuss the regulation of enzyme activity, and discuss the importance of enzymes in clinical diagnosis and treatment of disease. First and foremost, we define enzymatic terms. So unit of activity is 1 unit. It's the amount of enzyme that catalyzes the reaction of 1 nanomole of substrate per minute. Specific activity is the number of enzyme units per ml divided by the concentration of proteins in milligrams per milliliter. Specific activity values are therefore quoted as units per milligram. And the turnover number, this is your kcat, the number of molecules of substrate converted to product per enzyme molecule per second. For the catalysis of enzymes, we first define free energy of activation. This is the energy difference between that of the reactant and transition state, a high energy intermediate that occurs during the formation of a product. The rate of reaction is then determined by the number of such energized molecules, and they must contain sufficient energy to overcome the energy barrier of the transition state. Thereby, for a reaction to proceed, enzymes would lower the free energy of activation to make the reaction proceed faster. So if it's uncatalyzed, the free energy of activation is higher. Free energy of activation is lowered when there is catalysis. But final state of products are the same. And there are different factors which affect reaction velocity. One is the substrate, temperature, enzyme, time, and products of the reaction. So this would be the substrate velocity curve. So the rate or velocity of a reaction is the number of substrate molecules converted to product per unit time. This increases with substrate concentration until a maximal velocity is reached. So in theory, the more substrate that you add, the faster the reaction will proceed. However, if you reach your Vmax, where there is a saturation of your substrate compared to your receptors, rate of reaction would not increase anymore because you have reached the saturation level of a concentrate. Temperature as well affects rate of reaction. In general, more excited molecules in higher temperature would lead to an increase of velocity with temperature. Decrease of velocity with higher temperature because remember, your enzymes are made of proteins which tend to be denatured at higher levels of temperature. Your pH also affects rate of reaction. This affects your ionization of the active site, and pH may also denature enzymes. Some enzymes work optimally at different pH levels, such as pepsin, and trypsin, which would be your stomach acid enzymes, which would tend to work in acidic environments, as do your alkaline phosphatase, which would tend to work better in basic environments. This is the Michaelis-Menten equation, and at first, you could be intimidated just by looking at the equation alone. Um, we will discuss derivation, but I would not expect you to memorize it step by step. Just understand the concepts of your Michaelis-Menten equation. Remember that S is the substrate and E is the enzyme, and it forms an enzyme-substrate complex. Then, after the reaction, there would be an enzyme which is unchanged, and P would be the product, and your K1, K-1, and K2 are our rate constants. So for you to understand the Michaelis-Menten equation, you have to know the concept of initial reaction velocity and your maximal velocity, such that your Km, your Michaelis constant, and your substrate concentration would follow this equation. So there are three assumptions for your Michaelis-Menten equation. And I know that in your books, those are very wordy concepts. But let me summarize the Michaelis-Menten equation assumptions into pictographs or more simple equations or illustrations. So this is the first assumption of your Michaelis-Menten equation. S is for substrate and E is for your enzyme. And your first Michaelis-Menten equation assumption simply states that your S is so much greater than your enzyme such that any value of your E would be negligible in respect with your substrate. And that is your first assumption. Your second assumption, in summary, states that your enzyme substrate does not change with time because your rate of synthesis is assumed to be equal to your rate of degradation. And this third assumption, your initial reaction velocities are used because it is assumed that your enzyme plus product equation side of the equation would be so much lower than your initial reaction velocities and thus would be negligible as well. Such that when we derive this, your K1, your enzyme and substrate, and K1 rate constants and enzyme substrate complex would arrive you to the Michaelis-Menten equation that we know in our textbooks. And this concludes that your Michaelis constant is characteristic of an enzyme and its particular substrate, which reflects the affinity of the enzyme for that substrate. And here we have our Km concepts. So having a small Km for enzyme reflects a high affinity of enzyme for the substrate, as to a large Km of enzyme 2 reflects a low affinity of enzyme for the substrate. So the smaller the Km, the higher, the more attracted it is to the enzyme to the substrate. So your large Km, it would be more difficult for the enzyme to bind with the substrate. So this would be your Km concepts. And we could conclude with this Michaelis-Menten equation that the rate of reaction is directly proportional to initial velocity and Vmax. These are your enzymatic plots. This is your Lineweaver Burk. So I will not expect you to be able to derive equations or values from this, but know the formula and know that the relationship of your 1 over Vmax and your 1 over Km forms a line such that you could plot it in relation to your 1 over your initial velocity and your 1 over substrate. This is also your Eadie Hofstee. Again, nice to know. So it would follow that your Michaelis-Menten kinetics would follow according to your Eadie Hofstee equation, such that your Vm and your Vm over Km could be plotted in enzymatic plots. But your Michaelis-Menten equation is, like it or not, is that it is a single substrate reaction. Truth of the matter is enzymes react in multi-substrate reactions and therefore could be sequential, wherein both substrates must combine with the enzymes to form a ternary complex before catalysis can proceed. This can be likened to single displacement reactions. It could be random, wherein substrate A or B combines to form enzyme substrate complexes, or compulsory, wherein substrate A must form first the enzyme substrate complex first before it proceeds with B. Or it could be ping pong, wherein one or more products are released from the enzyme before all the substrates have been added. Okay? The one above is sequential, and the one below would be ping pong. For presence of inhibitors in a reaction, we must remember first these concepts. The Michaelis constant is increased in the presence of a competitive inhibitor, while the maximum velocity is the same in the presence of a competitive inhibitor. This is for competitive inhibition. In non-competitive, Michaelis constant is unchanged in the presence of a non-competitive inhibitor, while Vmax is decreased in the presence of a non-competitive inhibitor. So in competitive, and this would be affected by your negative or positive feedback when related to substrates. This is also feedback inhibition for enzymes. Also an example of feedback inhibition of your phosphates. So we have different clinical application of enzymes. In your clinics, you will be introduced to different concepts. We use it as widely in drugs. Enzymes are usually the ones deficient in disease. It's either in excess or in decrease of. So it's either we give enzymes to augment enzyme production or we give enzymes to depress enzyme function. It's also used to diagnose certain diseases, such as measuring the level of certain enzymes in disease. So these are just the few useful clinical applications of enzymes, hence the importance of learning enzymes in biochemistry. Okay. Thank you for listening to this lecture. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel for more lectures on biochemistry.